Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for tuning in to this afternoon webinar discussion we're calling Building Resilience When It Matters Most. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm a business journalist at Smith School of Business at Queen's University in Kingston. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to remind you that the discussion today is going to be recorded, and you'll be receiving a link to that recording by email in a couple of days. You're also going to have the opportunity to ask questions of our speaker, assuming we have time. He's got lots he wants to tell us. In order to ask a question of our speaker, please use the Q&A button, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, rather than using the chat screen. Use Q&A if you could. Finally, I want to let you know that today's webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dane Jensen. Dane Jensen is an expert on strategy and leadership and a furious cross-pollinator between the podium and the boardroom. He is the CEO of Third Factor, advising other CEOs and senior leaders in both sports and business. Dane's extensive global experience includes work across 23 countries on 6 continents in a range of industries with both small businesses and Fortune 100 companies. He works extensively with the Canadian Paralympic Committee, the executive team at Canadian Sport Institute Ontario, and Right to Play, supporting the leadership development of their managers and their volunteer coaches. He also teaches on a number of Queen's executive education programs, as well as Smith's full-time and executive MBA programs. Thank you for being here today, Dane.
It is my pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for the introduction, Meredith. And looking forward to spending the next hour talking about one of my favorite topics, which is the whole area of resilience. And in particular, how do we build resilience now when it kind of matters most? And of course, anybody who's going to sit and talk to you for 60 minutes about something is going to do it rooted in their own biases, and those are going to come from their experiences. And so I just wanted to talk for a little bit about where I come from with respect to the topic of resilience, so you get a sense of what I'm drawing on as we go through the content over the next hour. As Meredith mentioned, I run a company called Third Factor, and Third Factor for about 30 years has really been focused on one thing, which is pressure, right? How do we help people harness the power of pressure in the good times, and how do we navigate pressure in the tough times, in the troughs? And in order to do that, we really study the science of performance across a whole bunch of different disciplines and fields. You heard Meredith mention sport, business, academia. And our job, why we study performance, is really to help people learn how to transform pressure into growth. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, is especially when we are going through tough times, when we are under pressure, the more we are able to transform that pressure into a growth experience to feel like we're getting better, the more likely we are to emerge with a sense of satisfaction, because growth is ultimately what gives meaning to pressure. It doesn't necessarily make it enjoyable, but it gives meaning to the pressure that we're facing. And so in order to help people learn about pressure, we kind of act as this giant cross-pollination hub. So what we bring to the Smith family is that we kind of sit at the intersection of all of these different places where pressure is present, the world of elite sport, business, government, academia, philanthropy. And I really think of it as our mission to figure out what can we all learn from each other. And the lessons are quite different because of, your life is not like the life of somebody trying to win an Olympic medal. Unless you are trying to win an Olympic medal, in which case you are dealing with your own significant pressure and setbacks right now in the wake of the postponement of the games, right? And yet there are things that we can learn from each other because pressure is a universal human experience, right? When we experience pressure, it impacts us in profoundly human ways. Our heart rate increases, our respiration rate increases, our muscles get tense. And because pressure is a universal human experience, we can learn things by studying people that are operating under immense pressure in extreme environments. And so in many ways, what we're going to talk about today are the things that as we've traversed these different environments have been present in all of them. They're kind of like the laws of physics, right? Gravity is going to look very different on Mars than it does on Earth, but it's still gravity. And that's the stuff that we're in search of today. Now, before we get into the skills around resilience, I actually want to get a sense of who's on the line with us today. I know there are many of you, and of course we want this to be as participative as is possible with a group of several hundred people. And so I want to test out some technology that we're going to use to interact a couple of times over the next hour, just to get a sense of who's on the line. So what I'm going to ask you to do is follow the instructions at the top of the screen here and pick up a device that's connected to the internet, your phone, a browser window, and just head to menti.com, pop in the code 288678, and then you have up to 3 check marks to spend to describe yourself. So have you been working from home or studying from home for more than 2 weeks, for less than 2 weeks? Do you have kids in the house? I have 3, 8, 5, and 3 who have been sent to the basement and told to be quiet on penalty of serious consequences. Do you have kids at home? No kids at home? Do you still have toilet paper? Are you running low on toilet paper? So let's just get familiar with the technology and get a sense of what folks are dealing with right now. All right, great to see all this stuff start to come in. Looks like people are able to access the technology, which is great. And a pretty even balance between folks that are working or studying from home more recently or have been at it for a little bit longer, people that have kids running around or not. Only 3 unlucky people that have run out of toilet paper. Pop your address in the chat, and I'm sure we'll pull our magic strings here to ship you some TP. All right, so that just warms us up a little bit with the technology. Interesting to see there's a pretty diverse array of experiences that people are kind of navigating right now as we go through this. So we will come back to Menti a couple of times over the course of the next hour. So just keep your phone handy or whatever you just used to put your information in for this poll. And great to see the numbers continuing to climb. So before we get into the skills of resilience, I actually want to do a little bit of definitional work. What do we even mean when we say resilience? And I'm going to define resilience by visiting somewhere perhaps a little bit unexpected. This is the Toronto Rehabilitation Institute. And Toronto Rehab is a hospital in Toronto. It's right across the street from Sick Kids, if you're familiar with kind of Hospital Row. And Toronto Rehab really focuses on very complex rehabilitations, things like traumatic brain injuries, spinal cord injuries. And in fact, they are the leading rehabilitation research hospital in the world, period. We're very lucky to have them as a country. Now, one of the things that they spend a lot of time thinking about at Toronto Rehab is balance and mobility. Because, of course, if you are rehabilitating from a stroke or a spinal cord injury, getting your balance back is vital because otherwise you may suffer a devastating fall, which is a big setback in your rehabilitation. Now, historically, the way that they have rehabilitated for balance is to teach people really stable defensive postures, right? Like, how do you stand in such a way that it's very unlikely that you're going to get pushed off balance? Now, what you see in the image on screen here is an evolution in treatment that is being driven by the research at Toronto Rehab. What they are starting to do is you will see that they have the patient here tethered to the ceiling, and then there is a physio on the right who is holding another tether. And then you have this guy on the left. Right? What do you think that guy's there to do? Sometimes people will say, well, catcher. And then I'll say, well, optimism is important when it comes to resilience, but no, that's not what he's there for, right? He's going to push her. He's about to push her over. And in fact, the lead researcher on this project, Dr. Avril Mansfield, her Twitter bio for a while was pushing people over in the name of science, which is a pretty good job description. Now, you might go, well, why would you take an elderly woman who has just suffered a stroke or a spinal cord injury and shove them over? Well, what they have actually discovered is that stable defensive postures are great until they're not. Once you get off balance, it's very brittle. You kind of tip over. And in fact, it's actually much more useful for people to learn what does it feel like to be off balance and retrain their stabilizer muscles to fire to get them back into balance. And so treatment is really evolving from focusing on stability to how do you respond and recover in the moment of unsteadiness. And for me, this is really at the heart of any definition of resilience. Resilience is not about how do I stand so strong that I never get off balance? How do I get a thicker skin so that I can take more arrows? Resilience says, hey, when I am inevitably knocked off balance, what are those stabilizer muscles that I can fire that can move me back into balance? And of course, while all of us are not rehabilitating from a brain injury or a spinal cord injury, we are all off balance, right? We are living that ancient curse, which is, may you live in interesting times. And these are the definition of quote unquote interesting times. You know what, I would argue that most people have not faced this kind of pressure, at least en masse, since at least 2008 and possibly even before that. And when we start to look at pressure, like what is it that causes pressure? Why do we feel pressure as human beings? The thing is, regardless of where the pressure is coming from, regardless of the context, you know, whether it's trying to win a medal in sports, it's dealing with pressure in your life, it's dealing with pressure at work. Pressure exists anytime two things are present. Pressure exists at the intersection of two things. You know, the first thing that has to be there for us to feel pressure as human beings is importance, right? We don't feel pressure for stuff that doesn't matter to us, if it's unimportant for us. And of course, right now we are dealing with tons of important things. We are dealing with our own health, the health of our family and friends, with our income, with our employment status, right? We are dealing with a wide array of incredibly important things. But just because importance is there doesn't mean we're going to feel pressure. The second thing that has to be there is uncertainty. Because just because something matters to me, if I know how it's going to turn out, that doesn't really create pressure. What creates pressure is this matters to me and I don't know how it's going to go, right? I'm not sure what the outcome is going to be. As human beings, we hate uncertainty. There was a remarkable piece of research done out of the University College London a couple of years back. And the way they did it is they hooked participants up to a variety of biofeedback sensors. So things that measured the physical markers of stress, like pupil dilation, heart rate, muscle tension, respiration. And then they had them do a little exercise on a computer screen. And the exercise was to flip over rocks, virtual rocks, and see if there was a snake under there. And if there was a snake under the rock, they got a small electric shock on their hand. Now, what people quickly learned was that there was always a snake under some rocks. Other kinds of rocks, there was never a snake. But then there was this third kind of rock that sometimes there was a snake and sometimes there wasn't. And here's what the research showed. It showed that physiologically, people were more stressed when there was a 50% chance of getting a shock than a 100% chance of getting a shock. Right? This doesn't make any sense. I mean, why wouldn't you prefer the rock where you might not get a shock? But it was the uncertainty that actually created the physical activation, right? The heart rate increases, the sweat increases, the pupil dilation. And so at this intersection of importance and uncertainty, both of which are through the roof right now, as human beings, we start to experience pressure. And so I want to make this a little bit more real for all of us on the line. You know, I want you to think about for yourself, right? What is it that makes these interesting times for you? And of course, in general, I think we can all say, you know, coronavirus, COVID-19, but specifically for you, what are the challenges and pressures that you are currently facing that impair your performance, that drain your physical energy, that emotionally exhaust you, that cause you anxiety, that take away the fun, that keep you rushing? I'm going to ask you to just reflect briefly on that and then pop one thing that comes to mind into the poll, right? So head back to where we were with the poll and just pop one thing in here. And I think these are going to scroll pretty quick because of the number of people we got on here. But let's just take a sec and see what are some of the things that come up. All right. And so we're seeing a real variety, right? Finishing my master's thesis in the middle of all of this, infecting someone else, my finances, no access to childcare, what's going to happen with my family and family dynamics, my stock market, my retirement savings, cash flow, the amount of communication, including conference calls, a sense of isolation, job security, income security, right? Just a huge array of things, the health of family, the health of friends, managing kids at home with working, and I'm having a firsthand experience with that right now. Older parents, absolutely. And so what we start to see is when we are in times like these, yes, of course, human beings have always had to navigate important, uncertain circumstances, but as you start to look at this list, what you see is that all the original stress was still there, the master's thesis, performance at work. Now we have all of these additional important, uncertain things like worrying about my job security, my health, my parents. And what starts to happen is that this importance and uncertainty starts to get compounded by volume. Right? Volume is the final element in the pressure equation, which is, yes, it's about important and uncertain situations, and then we've got how many of these things are we dealing with simultaneously. And so all three parts of this equation are in overdrive right now. We are dealing with incredibly important things like our health and our income. They are highly uncertain. We don't know how long or how deep this is going to go, and there are tons of them all at once. And so when all three components of the pressure equation are in overdrive, we start to see that manifest mentally and physically. And one of the data points that I've seen recently that really drove this home for me came from an organization called Big White Wall, which some of you may be familiar with. It's an online mental health community that was originally started in the UK. The name, which is a little bit odd, came from a literal big white brick wall of a community in London that was being displaced. They were being evicted and their houses were being knocked down. And they set up this big white brick wall where people could write what they were experiencing, how they were feeling as their community got displaced. Now Big White Wall is a virtual mental health community. It's moderated by clinicians. You can access it if you were in Ontario through Ontario Telehealth. And it's a place for people to talk about what they're going through, get interventions from therapists, et cetera. It's a great resource. A good friend of mine runs North America for Big White Wall, and he shared a data point with me, which is that last week they saw a 150% increase in utilization over the week before, right? 150%. And so when we see uncertainty, importance, and volume all go through the roof, this starts to tip people over into distress. And so clinical mental health resources are vital. Resilience, for me, is a little bit upstream from clinical, right? This is the massive middle of people who are feeling the strain, who are feeling the importance, the uncertainty, and the volume. They feel like they're heading downstream and there's that waterfall ahead. It's how do we give people tools? How do you build the skills that allow you to backpedal, right? That allow you to prevent that tip over into some of the more serious stuff, right? To give people skills that allow them to manage their reality. And so what we're going to talk about today is, well, what are those skills? And how do we access them? How do we strengthen them as individuals? And at the very heart of all of this stuff, right, we're going to talk about a number of skills, but there is one fundamental transformation, which is we want to equip ourselves with the skills that transform a feeling of helplessness into a feeling of self-efficacy. And self-efficacy, which is a term coined by Albert Bandura out of Stanford, really is my own belief that I can impact my circumstances. Right, that I can make a difference to my circumstances. I'm not just helpless in the face of all of these stressors that I'm facing. Because what we know is that helplessness is at the root of the negative impact of pressure. When I feel like the pressure is just sitting on top of me and there's nothing I can do, it's like a rock that's pinning me down, that's when pressure starts to be a little bit corrosive and we start to go over that waterfall. When I connect with my self-efficacy, when I feel a sense of control, like I can change things, that's when we can change the experience of pressure. And so broadly speaking, there are really four ways. There are four choices we can make to connect with self-efficacy in the face of pressure. The first is really about eliminating any unnecessary stressors. And this is the first choice for a reason, right? If you are carrying a 50-pound suitcase through the airport of life, although most of us are not visiting airports right now, right? Why not check that suitcase at the gate, right? Don't try to lug it around all the way to the plane. And so we want to look and make sure there is not a stress that we don't need to be carrying around that we could simply let go of. That's choice number one. Now, of course, you cannot always make this choice, right? We cannot eliminate all of our stressors, especially right now where so much is outside of our control. And so the second choice that we have is to build and maintain our physical resilience. And the research is pretty unequivocal on this. It is almost impossible to be mentally resilient over the long haul if the physical platform is letting us down. And what I am not necessarily talking about here is training to win the Boston Marathon or run an Ironman. I mean, that's great. If you want to take this time to get even fitter, good for you. What we're really talking about here is, are you taking care of the basics, right? You getting enough sleep? Are you eating reasonably well? And are you moving around every once in a while? The third choice that we have is about building and maintaining relationships. And, you know, our co-founder, Sandra, has a wonderful metaphor for this. You know, she talks about how when we are going through periods of change or upheaval, it's almost like we are circus performers that are between trapezes. right? It's like you've let go of that one, you're reaching out, there's another one in front of you, but there is that moment where you are suspended in midair, right? You are not supported by anything. And her point is always, well, what is it that allows a circus performer to be suspended 40 feet in the air between trapezes? It's that there's a safety net down there, right? And for most of us, that safety net is made up of the people who care about and love us unconditionally, right? The people who will be there for us regardless of whether we have our job or don't have our job. You know, whether we're able to stick to the timelines at work or we miss our timelines, right? All of that stuff that stresses us out and creates pressure, that safety net is there because those people will love us and care about us regardless of what happens. And so what you want to know about yourself for your own resilience is when you are under significant pressure, are you the type of person that is able to reach out and tend to that safety net to build it, or do you tend to withdraw and shut the door and say, you know what, I got to get this figured out? And in particular right now, while we are being advocated, you know, to self-isolate, to social distance, this becomes even more important, right? Are you creating the opportunities to build and maintain the relationships with that close support network? And then the fourth and final choice that we have, and this is the one that we're going to spend the next half an hour on, is to build the inner skills that increase resilience. And this is a place where we can always connect with our self-efficacy, right? We can always choose the inner skills that we are going to use to navigate our reality. And the skills that we are going to look at are codified in what we call the inside edge model. And this model was first articulated by our founder, Peter, almost 30 years ago in his book, The Inside Edge. And we've spent the past quarter century really deepening our understanding of each of the components. And so let me give you the 10,000-foot spin through this thing, and then we're going to go through it piece by piece. So in the center of the model, we have our self. And that is because self-awareness is the foundational resilience skill. Then surrounding ourself, we have our body, our feelings, and our mind. These are our tools of action in the world, what we think, how we feel, and ultimately what we do. Now, you will notice that the body, the feelings, and the mind are separate from the self. And this is very deliberate. And this is because human beings, alone as far as we are aware, have the capacity to step back and observe ourselves. Right? I can think about what I'm thinking about. We call that metacognition. I can think about how I'm feeling, right? I'm really anxious. I'm really nervous right now. I can notice what's going on physically, right? My breathing's really shallow. My muscles are really tense. The snake does not have this ability, right? If it's going through the jungle and it hears a twig snap over here, it doesn't go like, huh, I'm feeling really angry right now. My back is really arched, right? It strikes. It's stimulus response, right? There's no pause. Stimulus response. As human beings, we are at our least resilient when we get into that stimulus response automatic thing, right? Resilience is found in this ability to step back, notice the impact that pressure is having on me, right? I'm feeling really anxious right now. My thought loops are all about the negative things that I think are going to happen. My body's really tense. And from that position of observation, which many would call mindfulness in sports psych, they talk about it as active awareness, now I am granted free will. Once I step back and become an observer, now I can choose how I want to respond. I'm not a slave to my default response. You know, there is a big difference between being angry and noticing I'm angry. Right? When I am angry, the anger is driving. When I notice that I'm angry, now I get to choose. Right? I get to make a decision. It's almost like shifting the car into neutral. And from that position of observation, this is where we get to the 4 points of the compass. Right? I can make different choices. I can make a choice around my perspective, right? How am I looking at the situation that I'm in? I might notice that my energy is all out of whack on the western point of the compass. I need to turn my internal thermostat down and choose an action to do that. I might look to the southern point of the compass and realize that the movies I'm playing in my head about the future are not supporting the state that I want to be in, and I can choose to act there. Or I might notice that the things I'm focused on are really not connected to my North Star, to the stuff that actually matters to me. And so I can consciously choose to redirect my focus. But first, I've got to notice, right? I've got to step back and notice the impact pressure is having on me, because that's where I connect with free will. Now, from that position of observation, let's talk about the things around the outside. And we're going to start with perspective. And we start with perspective, and we will spend the most time on perspective because at a very fundamental level, our perspective probably has the most sway over our resilience. And that is because ultimately how we look at a situation determines how we're going to respond. Right? To use a very simple example, if I'm in a meeting and I get a really difficult question, I'm going to respond very differently if I choose to see that question as a threat or as an opportunity to demonstrate my expertise. right? Same question, different frame is going to lead to a very different response. The other thing that makes perspective so unbelievably powerful is, if you go back to what I said about self-efficacy earlier, this ability to connect with what I can control, perspective is the only thing in this entire universe over which we always have control. We are always able to choose. And if you are ever in a situation where you are going, okay, show me the person who can reframe this situation, like this is an unambiguously bad situation, I would encourage you to read a little book called Man's Search for Meaning. And many of you may have read it. It's a classic. It's a seminal book. I read it in high school as part of my English curriculum. But Man's Search for Meaning was written by Viktor Frankl, who was a Polish psychiatrist who was interred in the Nazi concentration camps in World War II. And what Frankl learned through that horrific experience and ultimately wrote about was his realization that the Nazis could take almost everything. They could take food, they could take clothing, they could take shelter. The one thing they couldn't take away from him, he wrote, was his ability to choose to see what he was going through as a meaningful experience. He called that the last human freedom, his ability to choose to see what he was going through as meaningful. And he talked about how, in his observation, the people that were able to make that choice to see meaning in this horrific ordeal were able to remain much more resilient through the process. Now, another pretty smart guy, Einstein, came at the same idea from a slightly different tack. Einstein once said, hey, if you want to know the most you possibly can about another person, but you only get one question, make it this one. Is the universe a friendly place? Is the universe a friendly place? Right? Everybody's going to have a default answer that pops into their head, right? And of course, there is no right answer to this question. We don't even know what the universe is. Is it matter? Is it energy? Is it finite? Is it infinite? Is a black hole friendly? Is it unfriendly? I mean, there's no right answer to this question. But what it does reveal is a bit of a rudimentary insight into when you go through situations, are you likely to anticipate good stuff happening and open yourself up? Or are you likely to anticipate harm and therefore move to protect yourself? And the reason this matters when it comes to resilience is because of something known as projection. And projection essentially says, as I move through the world, I project my values, beliefs, and perspective out onto situations. In other words, I don't see the world as it is, I see the world as I am. Now, I had trouble with this. Honestly, when I first learned it, I'm a pretty left-brain guy, and it was kind of like, okay, I get it. I project some stuff, but there's a ceiling, there's a floor, there are four walls. Like, there is an objective reality out there. And this concept was really landed for me, like so many things are, by a story that Peter told. And it's a story about a little girl who's driving in the back seat with her mom. And all of a sudden she says to her mom, Mommy, where are all the bastards today? Where are all those bastards? And her mom turns around and she says, don't worry, dear. They only come out when your father's driving. Right? That's projection. That's projection. It's the exact same people on the roads, right? People who are looking for parking, or maybe they're from out of town and not familiar with the roads, but only the father is going to see the bastards. And he's going to find them everywhere, right? Because he hates them. And so what we want to know is the stories we are telling ourselves about the situations that we are in, we project those out onto reality. And what that means is that the perspective we're holding impacts literally every aspect of resilience. The stories we tell ourselves about us impact our confidence and therefore our performance. The stories that we tell ourselves about our situations actually impact our physical responses to stress, how much adrenaline, how much cortisol our body produces, which means they change our health and well-being under stress. And the perspective that we hold changes our ability to bounce back from setbacks. Martin Seligman, who's kind of the father of positive psychology, showed that people who are more pessimistic tend to see setbacks as personal, pervasive, and across the board, right? They are personal, they're about me, they're pervasive, they apply everywhere, and they're permanent. They're going to last forever. And because of that, they tend to move to action more slowly than optimists who see setbacks as one-offs that are out of their control. And so we really need to pay attention to what perspective are we holding and how is that impacting our confidence, our health, and ultimately our recovery. Now, what we don't want to do is try to, be a Pollyanna and only see the opportunities, only see the good stuff. Because at a moment like this in history, that's entirely disingenuous, right? It will feel incredibly fake to go, you know what, let's just look on the bright side of life and see all the good stuff. Instead, what we are trying to do from a resilience standpoint is to round out our perspective, to see all of reality and all of what is true. And the best metaphor I've ever come across for this is the Chinese word for crisis. Right? The Chinese word for crisis is made up of two characters, each of which are words in and of themselves. We have the character that represents danger and the character that represents opportunity. And the goal from a resilience standpoint is to recognize that both of these can be present at the same time and work to round out our perspective to hold all of it. You know, Jim Collins in the seminal book, Good to Great, talks about this as the Stockdale paradox. And he named it after Admiral Jim Stockdale, who he interviewed for the book. Stockdale was a pilot who was taken prisoner of war early in Vietnam and did not get out of the POW camp until the end of the war. And so he was captive for several years. And when he got out, he started talking. He got interviewed by people about how did he survive this horrific ordeal. And one of the things he told Jim Collins, he said, you know, from the moment I was captured, I always knew that at some point in the future, this would be a distant memory. And I would have survived it, yes, but I would also look back on it as a defining moment in my life, a moment that helped shape me into the person that I would become. And so Jim said, well, so you were an optimist. And Stockdale said, no, I was not an optimist. Right? The people who said, oh, we'll be out of here by Christmas, and then Christmas came and went. Oh, we'll be out of here by Easter, and then Easter came and went. He said they did not do well. They got broken early. He said, I was able to confront brutal reality. This is going to be long. This is going to be hard. This is going to be painful. And someday this is going to be a distant memory that I see as a defining moment in my life. That's what we're talking about when we talk about a resilient perspective, right? I can see all of it. I can confront reality, warts and all, and make it to optimism. Now, in theory, this can sound good. It's like, okay, yeah, this all makes sense conceptually. The key is, can you actually do this in the moment, right? Are you able to access this broadening of perspective when the world is bombarding you with all the dangers and all of the threats? And so in order to do this, I'm going to introduce what I think is a really practical process that you can use personally, but also with a team for how do we actually do the work of rounding out perspective. And the process is really rooted in some incredible research that was done out of the University of Chicago by Salvador Madi and Suzanne Colbassa. And Madi and Colbassa were embedded in the Illinois Bell Telephone Company when the telecom industry got deregulated in the US. They were organizational psychologists who ended up studying the impact that a jarring disruption like deregulation could have on people at work. And so they were there for about 6 years before it got deregulated. Then the hammer fell. And it's still regarded as one of the biggest disruptions in business history. They ended up downsizing by almost 50%, so half of the employees lost their jobs. There were many people that they surveyed and interviewed that had had upwards of 10 bosses in the span of 24 to 36 months. And they stuck around for 7 years following the deregulation, and they tested people medically, they did interviews with people, and they were ultimately looking at what made the difference between the people that emerged from this experience healthy from people that emerged from the experience sick, that had to go on stress leave, had high levels of absenteeism. And what they found was that there were 3 factors that made a difference. The first 2 they called buffering factors because they had a small mitigating impact, and that was exercise and social support. The third thing, and this was the biggest factor that they found, was what they ended up calling personality hardiness. And in fact, this had such an impact that they decided to codify it and see if they could teach it to people. So what they found was that people that emerged from this experience healthy and with minimal disruption, although everybody was disrupted, were able to see what they were going through with a sense of commitment, control, and challenge, whereas the folks that had the most impact, health-wise, performance-wise, had a perspective of alienation, powerlessness, and threat. And let me go through this just briefly. So commitment, I choose to see this as interesting and important. I lean into it as opposed to trying to distance myself from it and ignore it. Control, I choose to focus my attention where I can have an impact rather than feeling that sense of powerlessness that we talked about earlier. And then challenge, right? I see this as something that I can rise to as opposed to a threat that is ultimately coming for me. So how do we actually work to cultivate this mindset? How can we come to a place of commitment, challenge, and control? Well, let's actually do a live example, and let's use a real situation that we are all facing right now. So the first thing we want to do is identify, well, what is the adversity or the crisis that we're facing? And I think for all of us right now, that's pretty clear and present, right? It's COVID-19. Now, again, what you do not want to try and do is jump immediately to, okay, well, what are the opportunities that this presents? right? When you're doing this for yourself, you won't believe yourself. You know that there are threats and dangers. If you're trying to do this with a team, they will immediately see you as the leader who is just kind of ignoring reality. Let's shuffle that under the carpet and try and get to, the stuff that I want you to do, that I want you to seize from this. And so we actually want to lean into the threats and dangers first, get a really good sense of what is all the bad stuff that comes as a result of this situation. And so you will have your own list. I'm sure it's different than my list and others' lists, but it could look something like this, right? Might lead to layoffs or cutbacks, that all events and training are canceled. That's a big one for us as a training business. Teammates or their families might fall ill, a loss of morale at work, retirement savings dropping, people required to sacrifice and work harder. So we want to get at a robust list of what are all the dangers and challenges. Here's the key though. Once we've articulated that list, now we want to go through them and identify what are the ones that I can control or influence, and what are the ones over which I have no control. So I might go down and put an X beside the things that I don't have control over, right? Whether the company initiates layoffs, that might be outside of my control, depending on where I am in the organization. The fact that events and training are getting canceled, that's out of our control. We don't make the travel policies for our clients. Right? Teammates and their families falling ill, well, I can influence that. That's the C. I can have some measure of control, right? We can put policies in place. We can engage in social distancing. And at the end of the day, ultimately, it is out of my control. Loss of morale, on the other hand, we can act on that. We can take control. We can mitigate that. We can work on it. We can think about creative ways to use video conferencing to keep a sense of community. Retirement savings dropping, there's probably not much I can do about that in the short term. I might be able to mitigate my strategy longer term, but right now that's a little bit outside of my control. And then people required to sacrifice and work harder, we can probably act on that. We can at least influence that a little bit. And so the key here is now two things. For the places that I can control, I want to have a very clear next step, right? I want to connect with my self-efficacy and say, what's the biggest thing I could be doing in each of these areas where I've identified I can control or influence them? For the areas that I've identified that I can't control, that I have an X, I have only one course of action, which is I need to get to a place where I can direct my attention away from those things. I need to be able to let go of them to the degree that I can possibly can, because there is nothing I can do. And the more I focus on trying to change those things, the more I am engaged with a sense of helplessness and powerlessness. And so in particular at work with the team, if the team is worried about layoffs, if they're worried about the financial impact, our ability as leaders is to try to get to a place where we are redirecting attention to what are the things that we can control, right? Because that's where the margin is. And that brings us to the final step, which is, okay, we wish we weren't in this situation, but are there any opportunities that we can try to seize, that we can redirect our attention to and away from the threats? So this might be, an opportunity to learn and master new ways of working. We are all getting very familiar with Zoom and collaborative technologies, right? This might be a chance to accelerate our digital transformation, to transition to a flex work culture, to demonstrate our value to the communities in which we operate. That's a big one that companies are trying to do right now. It's how can we give back? What can we do for other folks? And so by going through this process, this is a really, really practical way to start to build a sense of, hey, I want to get committed to this and engage. I want to focus on what's the stuff that I can control. And let's, take the challenge of what are some of the opportunities that we might want to try to access in the midst of this. So that's perspective. The second area that we're going to focus on briefly is energy management. And, a lot of times when we're dealing with volume, we turn to time management. And time management is great. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to disparage time management. But at the end of the day, what happens to people who get really good at time management? Do they get more volume or less volume? More, right? Time management is a bit of a blind alley because the better I get at it, the more stuff tends to get loaded on my plate. And so when we are faced with volume, we actually want to be paying attention as well to energy management, right? How am I modulating my energy through the days and weeks to make sure I'm not constantly revved up or really flat? And the key word here is management, because left at the mercy of our biology, we are not particularly good energy managers. We have this thing called the fight or flight response, which is embedded in the back of our brain. And a Harvard cardiologist named Dr. Herbert Benson about 40 years ago wrote a great book called The Relaxation Response. He was a heart doctor that showed that the fight or flight response is not nearly as finely tuned as we would like it to be. It originally evolved to deal with literal physical threats. So when that proverbial saber-toothed tiger is standing face to face, your body gets flooded with adrenaline and cortisol and oxygenated blood and all that good stuff, so that you can punch this thing in the face or run away. What Benson showed is that fight or flight response is getting tripped constantly in the modern world by things that it didn't really evolve to deal with, right? Like, so you are about to head to bed at night and like an idiot, you check your phone one last time and there's a big, breaking news caps lock alert, or there's an email from a client going, oh my gosh, things are blowing up. Boom, your fight or flight response gets tripped. You can't fall asleep. And so what Benson showed is that fight or flight response, we're dealing with this trip that is leading to buildups of cortisol and adrenaline in normally healthy people that was leading to the heart stuff that he was seeing as a cardiologist. And so to go back to a bit of a metaphor, what we're trying to do under pressure when it comes to energy is we want to learn to be a little bit less like thermometers and more like thermostats, right? A thermometer just rises and falls, right? If the room's heated, I get heated. If the room's cool, I get cool. A thermostat, on the other hand, says, no, I get to set my temperature. Right? I get to decide where I want to be in this situation, and then I have skills to manage my energy level. Now, all of this is predicated on that fundamental skill of noticing. Do I even notice when my inner thermostat is cranked or too low? And so this is where we want to practice that foundational skill of, at various points during the day, taking 30 seconds, 60 seconds to just step back and observe. Right? What am I thinking about right now? How am I feeling right now? What's going on at the body level? Are my shoulders tense? What about my forehead? Is there any tension in my forehead? We just want to take these little 30 to 45 second pauses and check in and notice what's going on from an energy standpoint. Maria Gonzalez, who's a wonderful woman that I had the pleasure of working with at Smith, who is an expert in mindfulness. She has a great book called Mindful Leadership. She talks about these as micro-mindfulness moments, just taking 30 seconds, 60 seconds to check in. And sometimes when you check in, what you're going to notice is the thermostat's too high, right? I need to be able to turn the thermostat down. And here's the good news, is that you can go in at many different ways to turn the thermostat down. There are skills that you can go in at the mind level. So going through a reframing exercise like we just went through is a great way to turn the thermostat down to get some perspective on the situation. You can go in at the feeling level. We're going to talk about imagery next. The things that we imagine are kind of the hotline to our emotional state. Often, however, we carry the excess energy physically, right? Our breathing gets rapid, our shoulders get tense, right? Our jaw starts to clench. And so because we carry the excess energy physically, often we want to score a direct hit and just go in at the body level. And the single most effective way to go in at the body level to turn the thermostat down is with a breathing technique. And so because breathing is so darn important, because it is the #1 way that we can turn that thermostat down, we want to learn from a world champion breather, right? We want to learn from the best. And so I'm going to bring an expert into the session now, this guy, right? Babies are the world champion breathers. Babies breathe the way that we were meant to breathe. Why? They don't know about COVID-19. Right? They don't have a retirement portfolio. They are not raising teenagers who are now home from school, right? They don't have any stress. And if you watch a baby breathe, what you will see quite clearly is that the diaphragm rises and falls. The diaphragm rises and falls. When we feel pressure, our breathing starts to move up and up into our chest. And when breathing gets into our chest, our energy levels start to rise. And that's because of the balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide. When we engage in chest breathing, we actually have too little carbon dioxide in the system, which is kind of counterintuitive. But carbon dioxide is actually a natural tranquilizer. And so when we move our breathing down into our diaphragm, we actually increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the system, which starts a chemical reaction that naturally brings our thermostat down. And so the key imperatives from a breathing standpoint are to breathe low and breathe slow. Ideally, we want to slow our breathing down to about 6 breaths per minute. That's 1 breath every 10 seconds. That feels very slow for most of us. If we can engage in about 6 breaths per minute of diaphragmatic breathing, that begins to put your body in a state of what's known as coherence, which is when your breath synchronizes with the rising and falling of your heart rate. This is a very regenerative state. It's a great place to be in to bring that energy level down. The good thing about breathing, by the way, is people expect you to breathe. It's a skill you can use pretty much anywhere. In fact, if you're in a meeting, people tend to get more concerned if you stop breathing than if you move your breath down to your diaphragm and just slow it down a little bit. So that's energy. let's talk about imagination. And let's start with a simple truth. That is, people are constantly running movies. We are always running movies in our head, either about what's going to happen, what is happening, or what just happened. And what we want to recognize is that the movies that we are playing in our head have a significant impact on us, mind, body, and feelings. When we're kids, these movies are very front and center, right? And in fact, in young children, they don't even really differentiate between the movies in their heads and the movies in the real world or the real world itself. When my eldest son, Jack, was 3, he dressed up as Batman for Halloween. He was obsessed with Batman. And we went outside, we went trick-or-treating down the street, we turned the corner, and he ran smack into this big 11-year-old kid dressed as the Joker. And he literally collapsed on the ground sobbing, right? Like he was sure he was about to get attacked, and he did not like his odds against this 11-year-old kid. Because you see, for him, he was Batman, right? There was no difference between the movie in his head and what was going on in the real world. As we mature, as we grow, of course, we quite healthily start to be able to distinguish between the stuff going on internal and external. The movies start to become much more subconscious. Here's the thing, though. That's just because the curtain is closed doesn't mean the movies aren't still playing. And those movies, whether conscious or not, have a huge sway over us because it's the only way we communicate with ourselves that goes in at all of the mind, the feeling, and the body channel. And I want to bring this to life. So we're going to take a look at the body, right? Your body does not distinguish between real and imagined experiences. What I mean by that is if you have thrown a ball before in your life and you close your eyes and vividly imagine throwing a ball, your body will fire the same neuromuscular pathways as if you actually threw a ball. Now, what does this mean for us? What this means for us is if we have a bad interaction with a colleague or a tough conversation with a client and we replay it 6 or 7 times on the way home from work, to our body, it's like we have experienced it 6 or 7 times. I get the same adrenaline, the same cortisol, the same muscle tension, all of that stuff. So it can dramatically prolong recovery. Now, I actually want to make this real. Let's bring this to life. And so just bear with me. If you'll indulge me for 2 minutes, I want you to just kind of sit straight in your chair, feet flat on the floor. And if you're comfortable closing your eyes, please do so. If you're not, just stare ahead. And just follow along in your mind's eye with my words. I want you to go to your kitchen. See what you'd see in your kitchen. Hear what you'd hear in your kitchen. And in your kitchen, I want you to walk over to your fridge and grasp the handle of the fridge. Pull the fridge door open. Really feel it. Suction of the door, cold air. And in the fridge, you're going to find a ripe yellow lemon. I want you to pick it up. Feel the cold, waxy skin where it connects with your hand and fingers. Now close the fridge. Take the lemon over and put it down somewhere where you would cut fruit. And go get a knife. As you pick up the knife, really feel the contours of the handle, the weight of the blade. Bring it back over to the lemon and cut the lemon in half. Smell the spritz of lemon juice in the air. See the juice running off the blade of the knife. Now I want you to take one of those halves and cut it in half again. And take one of those 2 lemon wedges, bring it up to your nose, and just inhale deeply. Smell that crisp, clean lemon scent. And now I want you to lower that lemon wedge to your mouth and take a big, juicy bite. Taste the tartness of the lemon juice squirting into the back of your throat. All right, come on back. Now I want you to pull out your phones, and I want you to notice what senses were present in your imagery. So just head back to Menti, and I want you to put in what are the senses that were present in your imagery. Did you have images, smell, sound, touch, taste? Now you see, as these answers come in, there is a reason we call it imagery instead of visualization, because there is more than visuals. You can see lots of people are getting images. That's the most popular one, that's for sure. But almost everybody got smells or touch or taste or sounds or something else that accompanied those visuals. And here's the interesting thing, right? What happened when you could taste that lemon? You start to salivate. And this is really interesting because salivation is an involuntary bodily response, right? Go ahead, try and salivate, right? Like where do you even squeeze, right? This is an involuntary bodily response. And so what this means is that biting into an imaginary lemon has triggered the exact same physiology that you would have if you bit into a real lemon. And this is what makes imagery so vital. When I say your body does not distinguish between real and imagined experiences, I mean it. What you are imagining is priming your body for what's about to happen, what is happening, and it's replaying what just happened. And so imagery can be a big ally in recovery from setbacks if we are imagining what we want, if we are using it productively, but it can also be something that stops our recovery, that prolongs our ability to recover from setbacks if we are replaying the negative game film over and over and over. The final thing we're going to look at today is the northern point of the compass. And this is really ultimately about, can I see a line of sight from the stuff I'm focused on moment to moment up to the stuff that really matters to me, that North Star stuff. And when it comes to resilience, purpose or North Star, this is like, the old oak log that you put on the fireplace that provides dense, slow-burning fuel. This connection to purpose, to meaning, this is like the long haul of resilience, that I can see a line of sight from what I'm doing up to that stuff. And in times like these, that line of sight can get very blurry, right? It's like, my health, that's what matters right now, and here I am, I have to do this Excel spreadsheet, I've got to put my expense reports, it can be a little bit dodgy to kind of see your way up to meaning. And for me, what's most important at times like these is to remember that connection to meaning is not this constant thing, right? It's not this thing that's always there, that's always on. And the best example I have of this is my kids, right? As I mentioned, I got 3 kids, 8, 5, and 3, who are being incredibly good in the basement right now. And anybody who knows me very well would say that my kids are a huge part of my North Star. They're a big part of why I do what I do. And at the same time, my kids are a total pain in the ass, 70 to 80% of the time, right? And I think most people who have young kids, it's like, yeah, they're great. And it's like trying to get them to eat. They're constantly fighting with each other. Getting them dressed in the morning is a 45-minute ordeal. I had a 20-minute fight with my daughter a couple mornings ago about her pants. She's like, these pants are too wobbly. I was like, I don't even know what that means. So I don't really know how I'm supposed to fix that, right? And yet there are these moments, right? Usually when they're asleep. But even when they're awake, sometimes you have these moments. I remember when our eldest, Jack, was 3, and we bought him his first real puzzle. And I dumped it out in the living room, and I went to the kitchen to make a snack. And I got distracted. And by the time I came back, he had put the entire puzzle together. And I was like, this is amazing, right? It's unbelievable. Or Stella, when she was not quite a year old, we went grocery shopping, and I walked up with a stroller to the grocery store. And we came out, and it was mid to late November. And as we came out of the store, it was the first snowfall of the season, and she had never seen snow before. And so she's laughing, she's grabbing at snowflakes, we're running down the street with her and her stroller, right? We have these moments where life, with all of its ups and downs, connects for just a minute with what really matters to us. And resilience does not require a constant state of connection. That is not realistic. Especially right now, you are going to be dealing with the crap. There is going to be the ups and downs. Expense reports still have to get filed. You've got to navigate working from home. You've got to deal with new realities. Resilience is about, can you create those moments where what you are doing connects with what matters to you? And do you notice, right? Do you make sure that you are present for those moments? And I suspect all of us, as we reflect on the past 2 weeks, which has been very difficult, could think of 1 or 2 of those moments where we connected with what was really important to us. And so that is a rapid tour through a ton of content that, when we do this with Queen's Exec Ed or Smith Executive Education, often we will unpack this over 2 days, but hopefully you have a couple of things that you can take that will help you as you navigate what is a very unique and high pressure world over the next little while. I know some people like information visually, and it's helpful sometimes to have stuff that's front and center for you as you kind of go through this. So we've created this graphic recording that kind of summarizes a lot of what I've talked about over the past hour. So if, while we're doing the Q&A in the next 5 minutes, if you want a copy of that graphic recording, just head back to Menti, pop in your name and email, and we will make sure that you get a copy of that recording over the next day so that you can have it front and center. But with that, I want to thank you greatly for your time, and I will hand it over to Meredith to surface any questions that came up in the last 55 minutes.
Hi, Dane. That was amazing. Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions. Some of them are kind of big, but I wondered if you could take this one on. I mean, these are big topics and big issues about how we live in the world. This question is, do you have any tips? So you talked earlier about the things we can control and the things we can't control. And you just said, just focus on the things you can control. But this question is, do you have any tips on letting go of the things that you cannot control? How do you focus on just those things you can control and just not the things you can't?
Yeah, this is the $64,000 question, right? Sometimes the movies just won't stop playing in our head, regardless of how much we want to change the channel. And really, when we are talking about anything that has to do with, where am I focusing? This is at the heart of resilience, which is attention control, right? Which is developing this muscle, developing the ability to direct my attention towards things that are productive. And so this is really the domain of mindfulness, right? This ability to practice directing my attention meaningfully and on purpose by actually getting at it a couple of times a day. And the thing that's really important when we talk about mindfulness is a non-judgmental state. And so what we don't want to do is layer a sense of judgment on top of the negative movies, like, why can't I redirect my focus? Why do I keep thinking about this? It really is about just noticing that your attention has wandered back to that thing that you don't want to be thinking about, and gently correcting course, gently bringing it back to, okay, where is it most productive to spend my attention? And a big part of that sometimes is just naming it, right? If you look at CBT, which I am not an expert in cognitive behavioral therapy, but a lot of CBT is, do you notice the loops that are playing in your head, and can you interrupt and challenge those loops? And it literally is the act of naming it, noticing it, and then gently redirecting that starts to build that muscle that allows us to do those things. So there is no silver bullet for that. It is a life's work in many cases, but hopefully that's a little bit helpful.
That's great. We have another question. Is resilience something you're born with, or can you develop it?
Yes, both. So resilience is one of these things that certainly there are certain people that just naturally have ice in their veins. We are not going to free solo El Cap like Alex Honnold, unless you are born with a very specific disposition. And at the same time, resilience can 100% be strengthened. And I think we've actually seen that in spades in the sports system in Canada. If you go back to Montreal and Calgary, coming out of Calgary, Canada had the dubious distinction of being the only country that had hosted an Olympic Games and not won a gold medal on home soil. And in fact, we did it twice. We did it in Montreal, we did it again in Calgary. And then you fast forward to Vancouver, where we won more gold medals than any country in the world, right? There's a lot to that story, but a big part of the story is that we directed a lot of funding into mental performance. We improved our ability to convert good performances at World Championships into good performances at the Paralympics and Olympic Games. And so that is, we see it every day in our work in sport. It is a trainable skill. If you work on it, athletes, people, everybody can get better at this stuff.
So are there ways we could be working in these challenging times with building resilience in our own children as we navigate this challenging COVID situation?
Yeah, kids, it's always interesting how we want to talk about these situations with our kids, how we want to frame them for our children. I do think there is a very important lesson around separating what you can control from what you can't control. Now, kids, we don't want to put too much on our kids too early, so it really depends on how old your kids are, how much you want to engage in some of the narratives around building these skills. But certainly that ability to say, hey, there are certain things within our control, and that's where we're really going to focus our attention, and building that sense of self-efficacy, I think is a wonderful lesson, to try and seize out of this for sure.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dane. We're pretty much out of time. I know so many more people would love to ask you so many more things, but hopefully we'll have an opportunity to get to some of these questions later. A lot of people have been asking about getting recording to this presentation and to the slides. I just wanted to reiterate that we will be sending that out by email in the next couple of days. So yes, you will be getting a recording of this presentation, including Dane's magnificent slides. Before we wrap things up, I just want to let you know about some more opportunities for online learning here at Smith School of Business. Of course, lots of people are working at home right now and may be looking for some more opportunities for engaging in professional development. So Queen's Executive Education is offering a number of opportunities to pursue remote learning through live interactive streaming. You will see the link right here on the screen, smithqueens.com/execed. So to close things up, I do hope you enjoyed today's free webinar. Next week, we'll be doing this again. Stay tuned. You'll be getting an email about our next webinar. It's going to be called Coronavirus, What Every Entrepreneur Needs to Know Right Now. And in this webinar, we'll be exploring the challenges of navigating your business through this crisis. And we've got a lineup of all-star seasoned experts who are going to give us lots of advice on making it through the next weeks and even months, offering ideas for cash flow management, how to pivot your business, how to maintain a positive outlook, and much more. So we do hope that you'll be able to join us for that presentation. You'll be able to sign up very soon for that. So Dane, thank you so much for your amazing expertise and your very, very helpful information. I think a lot of people got a lot out of that presentation. Hopefully we can all start focusing on how we're feeling right now.
Yeah.
So thanks again. From all of us at the
my
Smith School of
pleasure.
Business, so from all of us at Smith School of Business at Queen's University, thank you everyone for tuning in, and we hope to see you again.